Hello. Today we're going to start with Chapter 4 of the illustrated story of Stephen Stroh. And Chapter 4 is called June Drop. It is the first week of June in New Hampshire. Great curtains of pine pollen waft from the hills, glowing like auroras in the sunshine. Flurries of aspen seeds sail through the thick air, warm weather snowflakes. Every year, Stephen's father shook the house with sneezing fits from pine pollen, but Stephen wasn't allergic to it. A new member had joined the outdoor crew. He was just 16 years old and had dropped out of school. His name was Alan Doyle. Stephen had met him in the mornings before everybody went off to their tasks for the day. He seemed nice enough, Stephen thought. He was skinny with blonde hair and a freckly face. He was friendly. Stephen wondered why he had dropped out of school. Stephen's impression was that the kind of people who dropped out of school were tough and had a kind of survivor's wit, like George Malloway, or were at least scrappy, like Jesse. But Alan Doyle was frail and boyish and cheerful. Stephen had not had time to talk much with him. At this time of year, each crew member had his individual job to do. Stephen would arrive and begin his morning routine on the tractor. His individual job was to operate the cutter bar, a solitary assignment. Sitting on the tractor, slowly moving through the orchard, gave him uninterrupted time to admire the beauty of that yellow pollen, how it affected the sunlight in different ways at different times of day. Sometimes the morning sun would shine on the pollen, making the sky glow golden. Other times, at other angles, the pollen dimmed the sun like smog to a beautiful orange ball, a sunset at noon, mid-sky. He knew that most people didn't like pollen. Nobody ever talked about it as beautiful. Stephen felt lucky he could be alone on the tractor where he could admire the beauty without having to restrain himself from talking about it. But soon the crew would work as a team again. One mid-June Monday morning, Ted Castro explained that one type of apple they grew at Rockmount Orchards had a certain malfunction. As you gentlemen know, he began, pacing the packing house floor as he spoke, following successful pollination, fruit set begins. And as I'm sure you all also know, in most cases the trees set more fruit than they can support, and they have a means of eliminating the excess fruit. This is called, of course, June drop. But one cultivar of apple we grow here does not conform to this tradition. That is Macallan. He raised a finger to emphasize this next point. The Macallan is, in my opinion, the finest dessert apple anywhere to be found. But we must help it along. Macallan does not observe the tradition of June drop. Left on its own, each branch would form clusters of apples that would grow no bigger than a golf ball. That is, without our help. Each of you will be furnished with a pair of clippers. We are going to thin the Macallans. He instructed Anton to take the outdoor crew to the Young, which had a large section of Macallans, and teach the new men in the crew, Alan Doyle and Stephen, how to thin the fruit. Doing something outside of the cutter bar routine seemed fun to Stephen, like a school field trip. The new guy's full name was Alan Charles Doyle. He asked to be called by his nickname, Holmes, after Sherlock Holmes. He told the crew that his father was a big fan of Arthur Conan Doyle, hence his initials. In the van going to the Young, Holmes explained that he'd quit school because he just couldn't stand it. He wanted to get out and work and make money. So he dropped out and started at the orchard. He spoke with delight that he had finally gotten out of school hell and was finally in the real world where he wanted to be. Stephen understood that sentiment, but thought it had been poor judgment for Holmes to drop out of school. As Holmes talked, everybody else in the van was quiet. Stephen had hated school as well, but had known that however unpleasant school was, whatever you did, you had to at least stick it out and finish high school. Stephen had been 19 years old when he'd finally graduated the previous December. He knew the embarrassment of that. He had liked his teachers as people, but never could keep up with the work they had assigned. Stephen had always fallen impossibly behind and had particularly resented teachers telling him, "You owe me 4 months of homework and a 5-page paper." Who were they to say that I owed them anything? Stephen thought to himself. He realized he was being silly, but still didn't want to admit to himself that his problems in school were due to defects in himself, not in the school. Of all the children in the Stroh family, Stephen was the only one who'd had such trouble with school. On several occasions, a worried Mrs. Stroh had asked Matthew to help Stephen with his homework. Matthew had tried to help Stephen by explaining that it was actually all very simple. If you want Mom and Dad to leave you alone, all you have to do is get good grades. Matthew seemed to have been under the impression that getting good grades was a matter of choice. Matthew was good at math. Stephen thought he'd had no aptitude for it at all. It was as if the neural pathways that facilitated such understanding had never fully developed, and in putting them to use, kinks in the wiring overheated in his brain, causing it to shut down. Sometimes Matthew's tutorial sessions became painfully frustrating and embarrassing for Stephen, ending with Matthew having exhaustively explained as well as he could to no avail, exclaiming, "Think!" gasping at his own frustration, at which time Mrs. Stroh would end the sessions. Holmes continued on and on in the van. "How sweet it is," he said, "to be out making money instead of being in that stupid school." Along the ride, Stephen studied the faces of the other crew members. Jessie stared at Holmes with a wry smirk. Then, looking at Holmes, Jessie thrust his top row of false teeth shockingly forward, then quickly withdrew them back into place. Holmes sat, eyebrows raised, silent and motionless, trying to figure out what he'd just seen. Then Jessie did it again, this time using his tongue to vibrate the teeth while holding his eyes open wide with his fingers. Stephen had not noticed before, but Jessie wore dentures. He had slid his whole upper palate out with his tongue. Jessie and Holmes laughed, but Stephen detected malice in Jessie towards Holmes. Stephen couldn't be sure. Jessie's thoughts were hidden behind his smirk, a poker face that Stephen couldn't quite see through. Then Jessie spoke to Holmes. "You think you're going to make money here? You quit school to do this?" He chuckled derisively. Brock looked at his boots and listened with pursed lips. No scheming appeared in Brock's face. Anton was driving, ignoring the quiet drama going on in the van. George Malloway and Bud were in the back seat looking out the windows, pretending not to pay attention. The crew arrived at the Young at about 7:30. The crew arrived at the Young at about 7:30. They got out of the van and trudged toward the top of the hill. As they ascended, the view around them expanded from merely pleasant to absolutely spectacular. From the top row, the tall buildings of Boston, perhaps 70 miles away, might have been visible through binoculars. The hillside faced southeast and received the full power of the sun, whose rays split off the dew-covered grass in rainbow glitter. The effect of sunlight on dew was punctuated beautifully by the lattice work of shadows of the apple trees on the grass. The distinctive two-syllable call of a male ring-necked pheasant sounded off from a far corner of the orchard. Kee-chee! And a few seconds later, Kee-chee! Again. Stephen knew that pheasants were not native to New Hampshire. Their native range extended from Japan in the east, westward through all of China, and further west to Soviet Central Asia, and south throughout India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. He knew about pheasants from fly tying. One of the first books he'd ever had, was Art Flick's Master Fly Tying Guide. That book had explained about the various breeds of pheasant there were, where they were native to, and what fly patterns they were used for. Stephen remembered that apples are also native to western China and Central Asia, the same place as ring-necked pheasants. Stephen wondered if the pheasants sensed a familiar spirit of home in the trees of the apple orchard. "This damn dew's going to keep my feet wet all day," Anton complained. Everyone else was quiet. The pheasant sounded off again, but only Brock commented on it. "I wish that pheasant luck in his romantic endeavors," he said. When they reached the top of the block, Anton directed Holmes and Stephen to which rows they'd be working in. Stephen would be in the top row. Holmes would be in the second row. Anton showed Stephen how to thin the young fruit. It was very simple. For every cluster of 4 or 5, leave 1 or 2. Leave the ones that look best. Get rid of any that appear small or damaged. Very simple. Brock gave Holmes the same lesson. Then he and Anton went to the far end, apparently to work toward the rest of the crew. Jesse, George, and Bud were also in the top row. Holmes was alone in his row. Stephen and 3 others were all in the first 4 trees directly uphill from Holmes, who'd climbed to the top of his tree. The sun had risen enough to take the morning chill out of the air, dry the grass, and illuminate from above a thin mist that still rested in the valley in the distance. Stephen worked in the same pattern as for pruning. He started at the base of branches which he could reach from the ground, clipping the excess fruit, which were about the size of ping pong balls. Then he climbed his tree, working upward to finish the tree while perched in its crown. Then Holmes yelped. Stephen looked over and saw an apple flying upward, having bounced off Holmes's head. Stephen saw that Jesse had thrown the apple and then had quickly turned back to his work. But Holmes knew it was Jesse. He threw an apple up at Jesse, but missed. Then George threw one at Holmes, hitting him in the shoulder. Holmes winced, composed himself, and threw one back at George. Then Bud joined in, throwing one down at Holmes, who had begun to laugh. Stephen recognized that kind of laughter. It was not the way one laughs at a joke, but an involuntary panic response. The 3 men pelted poor Holmes with apples. He was defenseless, having to throw uphill. They were bigger and tougher. Holmes was smaller and frail. Then it occurred to Stephen that it had been planned. Holmes was being hazed. Stephen remembered that a few days before, Jesse, George, and Bud had talked about how stupid it had been for Holmes to quit school. They had said that they had to find a way to convince him to go back to school and stick it out. Stephen remembered he had agreed with them, but hadn't known that this was how it would be done. Everybody started laughing. Holmes was getting pelted, while his shots missed or hit painlessly. Stephen threw an apple, hitting Holmes in the chest. Jesse grinned at Stephen. For Holmes, each hit came with real pain. He fought back, laughing and cussing, throwing uphill at the 4 men who rained apples down upon him. The men in the top row had another advantage that Holmes didn't have. Holmes faced uphill to the top row. And here's a picture of that. So Holmes there is in the white shirt there, and all the other guys. This would be Stephen Stroh, and the other guys pelting Holmes with apples. Okay, so Holmes faced uphill to the top row, his back to the valley, to the road, to the road that approached the block. The men in the top row all saw immediately when Ted Castro's truck came into view, as he came to check on the morning's progress. The sky blue Ford pickup pulled into the loading area of the block, out of hearing range of the workers. The hapless Holmes continued throwing apples up at the men in the top row, who had all assumed the aspect of diligent work, knowing that the boss would be upon them in a minute or two. Holmes continued shouting and throwing apples. He had not noticed that everybody else had stopped. The men in the top row pretended to work, waiting for the moment Ted Castro came within hearing range. "Come on, Holmes, cut it out and get to work," Jesse said, just loud enough for the boss to hear. Holmes kept it up, shouting, throwing apples. Stephen looked down at him and cringed. Ted Castro was standing just beneath Holmes's tree. Holmes carried on, while the men in the top row, including Stephen, pretended not to know that the boss was present. "Holmes, get down out of that tree!" Ted Castro shouted. Holmes was mortified. The other guys had started it, but even he knew it was hopeless to try to defend himself. Ted Castro marched him off to the truck and drove away with him. Stephen felt sorry for poor Holmes and felt guilty for participating in the hazing. He felt that the argument that it was for Holmes's own good was a thin justification, but he had joined in. At the end of the day, back at the packing house, he would learn that Holmes had received a harsh reprimand from Ted Castro and had been docked the day's pay. 2 of the packing house women, Tammy Wood and Caroline Crooker, told Stephen that they could hear Ted Castro shouting like they'd never heard before. That was the first time Stephen had heard the term docked pay. But he figured what it meant. He felt bad. But as guilty as he felt, he also felt that if the hazing made Holmes go back to school, then it could be justified. No, it can't, he thought again. He thought of Jesse. Jesse had dropped out of school too, and he had been to jail. Jesse knew that he was lucky to have any job at all after that. Work at the orchard was less than minimum wage, but Jesse at least had a job. Stephen understood that Jesse would see Holmes' foolish decision with an urgency that Stephen would not have considered had he never met Jesse. Stephen also hoped that Holmes would go back to school. He wondered if Holmes would dare to come back to work after the hazing. Then he wondered how Jesse had lost his teeth. That night, in bed, before he went to sleep, he thought of the fort. Stephen had been in 4th grade when he met Tom Larch. Tom was a friendly boy with curly red hair and freckles. Stephen was 10 at the time. All the other kids in Mrs. McGee's math class, where he'd met Tom, were 9 years old. Tom had invited Stephen to come over to his house after school. Stephen had accepted. That day after school, he took Tom's school bus instead of his own. He called his mother on the phone from Tom's house, telling her what he had done, and she'd been okay with it. She'd told Stephen that she would pick him up at 6 o'clock. Stephen had been afraid that his mother would have been angry, but she hadn't been. She was relieved. She had worried about Stephen, and that he had made a friend was a good thing. Stephen remembered the early days of that group of friends. They were good friends, he reflected. It started out as just that, children making friends, playing together, building models, fishing, and later camping. The circle of friends grew over the years as they grew up. As they grew up, from elementary school through junior high school and into high school, they gravitated around the Larches. They all gravitated around the Larches and the fort. The Larches lived on what had once been a dairy farm, but Mr. Larch was not a farmer. He worked for the town highway department. Their land was a sprawling field with a few apple trees beside the house. Next to the field was a patch of woods with some tall white pines with trunks 2 and 3 feet across. An old tractor path followed the perimeter of the pasture, and just outside that path, stone walls marked the property line. Beyond the stone walls were miles of forest. Amid the patch of tall pines beside the field was a cluster of 5 tall, straight-trunked trees that reached to perhaps 100 feet. Four of the trees forming the corners of roughly 10-foot square. The 5th tree grew about 4 feet from one of the corner trees. Tom's older brothers, Tony and Mark, had worked construction during their high school summer vacations. They had built the framework for a great treehouse with 2x8s lashed to the trees with rope and spikes. Tony had explained that because the trees would sway in the wind, one big spike in the center of the 2x8s was best. If you used 2, every time the trees swayed, the 2 spikes would fight against each other and either crack the wood or work themselves loose. They had nailed lengths of 2x4 at 4-foot intervals to the 2 trees growing close together to serve as a ladder. They had nailed plywood over the 2x8 framing to serve as a deck. Tony and Mark had grown up before they finished the treehouse and had passed claim to it down to Tom and his friends. Tom, Stephen, and the other boys finished it little by little, working on it after school, on weekends, and over summer vacations. By 7th grade, they'd built a roof of the same construction as the floor, having acquired 2x8s at night at construction sites of houses in a new subdivision nearby. They covered the roof with tar paper, acquired the same way. Leaving a hole for access, and the roof became a deck. They sheathed the walls with rough-cut boards and scraps of plywood. It was high in the trees, so high that from the roof, Stephen could look up and see the sky through the thin branches of the crowns of those tall pines. If anybody had ever fallen from that treehouse, they surely would have died. But nobody ever did. It took fearlessness and skill to climb the 2x4 ladder. The floor was perhaps 50 feet off the ground. Consequently, the kids knew that they had a secure sanctuary from parental scrutiny. None of their parents could climb up to what the kids came to call the fort. As Stephen and his friends began to grow up, the fort became the center of weekend activities of the kids in the area. By 8th grade, 2 factions had developed among the kids who belonged to the fort. One boy, Billy Crow, liked stealing street signs. He'd learned that stop signs, yield signs, and all traffic signs were secured to their posts with Allen head bolts. He'd gotten a set of Allen wrenches and discovered that he then had the power to take those things down. And take them down he did. Okay, here's a picture of the tree fort. You can see up there, and you see the sky. And the inside, I don't know if you can see it, but there's traffic signs and things like that. Okay, that's right. Okay, that's right. So the kids would camp out at the fort on weekends or any day during summer vacation. Billy would drink a couple cans of beer and challenge the other boys to join him in stealing signs. This grew to be the sign-stealing faction under Billy's leadership. The other faction, opposed to sign stealing, centered on Stephen and Tom Larch. We got a good thing going here. We all come here and hang out, drink beer and all. If you keep stealing signs, eventually we're going to get caught, and that'll bring this whole thing down, Stephen had once argued. Don't be such a wussy, Billy had said. You and little Tommy can stay here if you want. I'm going trophy hunting. I got a moose crossing all scouted out. Who's in? Okay, just a second. Let me redo that paragraph. So don't be such a wussy, Billy had said. You and little Tommy can stay here if you want. I'm going trophy hunting. I got a moose crossing all scouted out. Who's in? The same group of boys always went with Billy, sometimes walking, sometimes on bicycles. Late at night or early in the morning, they would return with 1 or 2 signs. They mounted the signs as interior siding of the fort. In time, the structure came to be sided almost entirely with traffic signs, even some on the ceiling. In the middle of the fort was a structure of 2x4s with a plywood surface that served as a table. The more the signs came to cover the unpainted boards, the more the fort took on a brilliance that made Stephen and the other opponents of sign stealing concede some respect to the Billy Crow faction. They had provided this wondrous atmosphere that only the people of the fort could know. Traffic signs are, of course, made with highly reflective materials. With the walls covered with signs, just one candle on the table lit the place beautifully. The mix of colors, red stop signs, yellow yield signs, green street names, white speed limits, orange men working signs, and the rest. The blue of an Interstate 89, all reflected on the faces of the boys in the flickering candlelight. There was even a license plate someone had stolen off a police car. Its number began with the letter G, which signified that it was from a police car. The boys had felt cool for knowing that. Okay, here's a picture of the kind of the goings on of the fort, the interior there. Okay. The real reason Stephen and Tom Larch were opposed to the sign stealing was that they felt it presented an unnecessary risk to their own illegal activity. Since around the time they had all turned 13 or 14 years old, Stephen and Tom had organized a system of acquiring liquor through connections with friends who were old enough to buy it. Stephen had learned that the state liquor stores provided complete price lists. Tom and Stephen obtained these and posted one in the fort. They also noted the prices of beer at local convenience stores. At school, discreetly, they would approach their friends asking if they'd like to place an order for the upcoming weekend. Stephen and Tom added 10% to the prices in order to provide a tip for the buyer. No money exchanged hands at school. That would have been dangerous. After school, Stephen would collect the money. Stephen had made up code symbols for each of his friends. Star, Moon, and Sun were Billy Crow, Stephen Spain, and Tyrone Jacobs, respectively. The hammer and sickle was Alan Price. Darrell McBain was 451 degrees. Okay, after the Ray Bradbury book. Other boys were Ice 9, MC squared, clubs, spades, diamonds, and hearts, and so on. The list came to have more than 20 boys. Only Stephen and Tom Larch knew of the code. It was written on a strip of lined notebook paper. Stephen would write each order on a separate piece of notebook paper in the same order as the symbol strip, which he would match to the lines on the order list to determine who had made each order. He figured that neither piece of paper would arouse suspicion if found by a teacher, even if they were both found. He realized that he could have simply used numbers for the code, but felt that having secret symbols that even the boys themselves didn't know was more dignified. It felt like spy work. Stephen would then make a consolidated list for the buyer. How many cases of Miller, how many 6-packs of Bud, pints of Canadian Mist, etc., in an effort to minimize suspicion in the liquor store, in liquor store clerks. He would meet the buyer at the fort after school on Fridays and give him the money and the consolidated list. The buyer would run the errand and meet Stephen back at the fort. Stephen and Tom would haul the delivery up into the fort hand over hand using a feed bag and rope. As darkness fell, they'd light candles and wait for the boys to arrive. As they'd arrive, Stephen would distribute the orders. When all had been distributed, Stephen would ceremoniously burn his list at the candle, just in case. He hid the symbol strip in his fly tying kit. It grew to be quite an operation. Sometimes orders amounted to more than $100, which meant a tip for the buyer of more than $10. At the time, that was enough to buy a case of beer. So Stephen and Tom never had trouble finding a buyer. All the kids who came to the fort enjoyed this service, including Billy Crow. Sometimes people would pool their money for a pony keg or a Matt's beer ball, which Stephen thought was especially festive. And I would point out the Matt's beer ball, this picture here, that is not a globe, that's a Matt's beer ball that Stephen is admiring. It's the first time he ever saw one. Okay. During these nights, the sign stealers would go hunting. As the boys turned 16, they got their driver's licenses. Some of them bought used cars. One boy, John Gockley, had bought an old GMC pickup. So one night, the sign stealers planned a great caper. Billy Crow had scouted out a great green highway sign indicating the exit for Brown Lake Road. The sign was about 5 feet by 12 feet, suspended beneath an overpass on Route 101. With the boys all gathered around drinking beer and whiskey in the beautiful light of the fort, Billy Crow stood and announced his plan. Soon, boys, we're going big game hunting. This one's going to be risky, but that's the price of glory. John, we're going to need your truck, Billy said. John Gockley jumped to his feet and saluted. For the glory of the fort and country, me and my truck are at your disposal, sir, he exclaimed, imitating a British accent. Excellent. Now I'm going to need 2 more volunteers, Billy said. All of the Billy faction raised their hands. You, Tyrone, and you, Spain, Billy chose. The rest of you are going to have to sit this one out, Billy consoled the unchosen. What's the target, sir? Asked Stephen Spain. The Brown Lake Road exit sign on Route 101, Billy said, enjoying the silence that followed. Yes, Billy paused theatrically. Men, We've graduated from the Allen wrench. This one's got bolts. They had a 4-man team. Each man had a specific job to do. Billy explained that John would drive. He'd drop off Billy and Stephen Spain, who'd be riding in the bed of the truck. They would each have a rope with one end fashioned into a harness, as mountaineers would do. They'd each have an adjustable wrench and work gloves. Billy would also have a hammer and a punch. John and Tyrone would drive the truck to a pullover used by fishermen near the overpass. It was out of the way, but in hearing range. They'd wait there. Billy and Stephen Spain would rappel from the guardrail down onto the face of the sign. With both factions together in the fort, Billy went over the details. He said that the nuts on the bolts were on the back side of the sign. He and Spain would rappel down and scramble into the framing on the back. There's a ledge you can put your foot on, Billy explained. He knew that one side of the sign would come loose first, and the sign would then swing down violently, pivoting on the last bolt. That could be dangerous, he said, and continued his briefing. First, Stephen Spain and Billy would each remove all the bolts except the top one on each side of the sign. Then Billy would just loosen his top bolt, while Stephen Spain would remove his. They'd need gloves to grip the sign, as they would have to lift it a little to allow the bolt to slide out. When Stephen Spain let go, the sign would swing dangerously. When the sign stopped swinging, Billy would knock the last bolt out with the hammer and punch. The sign would crash down onto the highway. That would be the signal for John and Tyrone to drive down onto the highway. Spain and Billy would climb back up onto the overpass, coil up their ropes, and scramble down to the highway. Tyrone would help put the sign in the bed of the truck. Then he, Billy, and Spain would sit on the sign to keep it from flopping out. John would drive back to the fort. That was the plan. We just have to hope that we get a 10-minute window with no cops going by, Billy said. Stephen had always thought the sign stealing was a bad idea, but he loved Billy Crow's enthusiasm and style. That night, Billy ended his briefing. Now, men, this organization does not award medals, but you who do this job will receive my respect. And men, that's enough. Stephen had been there for the planning. By this time, he knew that any protest he made would have had no positive effect. Stephen also admired Billy Crow's leadership skills and the way he explained the crazy plan. Billy had demonstrated how the sign would swing using the police car license plate and a nail. His explanation had been clear and well thought out, Stephen recalled. Over the next week, the team met after school to rehearse. They even practiced rappelling from the fort, starting on the lower 2x4 rungs, working up as they gained confidence. That Sunday, at 3 a.m, they left on their mission. Stephen and the non-sign stealers stayed around the fort waiting in anticipation. They'd built a campfire on the edge of the pasture. A little past 4, as the summer sky grayed before dawn, they heard the pickup coming up the road. It slowed down and pulled into the largest driveway. It drove slowly past the house, following the tractor path along the edge of the field toward the campfire, then passed by the fire and turned into the woods. Lights off, the truck rumbled slowly up the path in the woods to just before the fort. The sign quivered musically like a saw blade on each bump. They'd been successful. The truck stopped. The boys jumped out, telling about the close call they'd had. Stephen Spain started. "Woo! So me and Bill are hanging there, unscrewing the bolts, and this car's coming. I thought, oh God, don't let this be a cop. Billy, yeah, it's getting closer, and there's like no way to back up, no way to get back up. So we both were there. We're just there, you know. So we were both just like hanging there, the rope digging into my legs like mad. The headlights are lighting up the sign, and it's getting closer. You can just imagine what the dude in the car is thinking. Here are these two guys hanging from ropes from an overpass. What the hell are they doing? Whatever. It just went by. So we were lucky it wasn't a cop. Tyrone Jacobs joined in. So yeah, we're waiting in the truck and here comes that car. Nerve wracking. I don't know how we would have. I don't know what we would have done had it if it had been a cop. But anyway, we heard that thing slap down on the road. Yep. And then we just moseyed down and moseyed down with the truck, and Ty jumps out. They all get in, went like clockwork. That was fun. Get me a beer, John Gockley said. Okay, now I'm going to take a break. This is the middle of chapter 4. Okay, take a break.